This conversation includes content that may be sensitive for some listeners. Please take care when listening.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Lech Blaine grew up in country towns around southeast Queensland, part of a big, loving, knockabout, rugby league-obsessed family. When Lech was born, he had 6 older brothers and sisters, all of whom had come to the Blaine family as fostered children. 3 of these kids, Stephen, John and Hannah, were the biological children of a couple called Michael and Mary Shelley. The Shelleys had traded in their own privileged upbringings for Jesus. They were religious fanatics, wandering from place to place and living according to their own interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew. The Shelleys were in and out of jail and psychiatric hospitals, and they had lost custody of all their kids. They became infamous for threatening politicians, church leaders and judges in their campaign to get their children back. And one day, Lech's mum's worst fears came true when Mary Shelley appeared at her front door wanting to reclaim her children. This is the sensitive, complex terrain of how families are made and broken that Lech explores in his new book, Australian Gospel. Hi, Lech.
G'day, Sarah. How's it going?
There's a lot of people in this story, Lech, so let's start with your mum and dad. How did Lenore and Tom first meet one another?
Well, they met at a barbecue in Ipswich on an Easter weekend, 1978. And Mum was from rural Victoria, Dad was from Ipswich, and Mum had become really good friends with a woman in the kind of business department at Walton's. So she invited her out to Ipswich with a secret plot to set my mum up with her son Bruce, who was a bit of a wayward young man. And then by the time Bruce had gotten to the barbecue, my dad had already swept Mum off her feet.
How would he have done that? What sort of charmer was your dad?
Well, Dad was just this quite larger-than-life figure, both in terms of his personality, but also very big. He was, very kind of virile and vigorous, and had a very ribald sense of humour. And I think that Mum was very shy and very much like a wallflower, and I think she saw this guy who had no sense of fear about the world, that he was completely kind of comfortable with who he was, even though he was very rough around the edges, and I think that really appealed to Mum.
So he'd grown up in Ipswich. What sort of family had your dad grown up in?
A massive working class family in Ipswich, so I think his mother gave birth 17 times. Dad was the youngest in the family. His dad was a blacksmith on the railways. His mum was a stay-at-home mum, and they just had this really kind of like really loving but tough kind of family. And so, that was something that I think carried on throughout his life, was a desire to recreate that kind of scene.
How old was he when he started earning money to help out at home in that big family?
He dropped out of school at the end of grade 8, which he was the only member of the family to make it to high school. Everyone else had dropped out at the end of primary school, and so he had this secret dreams of becoming a banker, going off and getting a cadetship with the Commonwealth Bank. But his father said, Tom, you're a Blaine, you need to get a real job. And so
what did he do?
He dropped out of school and got a job at the meatworks in Ipswich. But when he was 16, he had a horrific meatworks accident and shattered his hip. And so he was in hospital for quite a long time because the hip injury got infected. And so it really left him at a loose end because, he didn't have an education, but now he also couldn't do vigorous physical labour. He was walking on crutches for a very long time and still walked with a limp for most of his life.
So what did he do to make money after that?
Heaps of different things. He was kind of like a jack of all trades. Like he started a house painting business with his brother. He bought a petrol station at one point. He had a news agency. He always kind of had a gambling syndicate on the side. He was breeding Dalmatians.
This is a very varied CV.
Very varied, yeah. He was just, but his mum had died when he was 13. His dad died when he was 16. And so he really knew, I think, that his destiny was in his own hands, and that, he needed to do whatever it took to provide for himself and then eventually to provide for his family.
And what about your mum's background?
Hers was a tough upbringing. It was slightly different to Dad's in the sense that I think one of the things about Dad, and, as I said, that appealed to Mum when she first met him, was this great self-belief. And I think that he was showered with love. He had so many older sisters. He had a mum who was like fiercely protective of him. He felt very much loved, and I think that carried him through the rest of his life. Whereas Mum grew up in a house where there wasn't that sense of love. Her father had a previous marriage with 2 kids and had basically done a runner with my grandmother, and there was like a 30-year age gap. And so they kind of grew up in Echuca in Victoria with, like a lot of alcohol around and not much money. They grew up in a council estate. And so Mum, being the oldest child, which again is slightly different to Dad, I think she was exposed to a lot more than her siblings, and she was kicked out of home at the age of 16. So she went to live in a caravan park in Echuca.
At 16?
At 16, yeah.
So she didn't have much formal education, your mum, but how important were books to her?
Well, books were really her, saving grace. Like that was her childhood and adolescence was spent burying herself in other worlds, and she was obsessed with Australian literature. She was obsessed with bush poetry. She loved Miles Franklin, and she would read these books and kind of dream of these landed gentlemen, riding into Echuca and saving her from this very anonymous sort of existence. And I think that she was blessed with this incredible intelligence. Like she really should have finished school. She really should have gone off to university. I think nowadays you'd kind of maybe say that she was hyperlexic, like she consumed literature in a really weird way. And, I'm someone that reads a lot of books, but nothing like what Mum did.
What do you mean?
Well, she was a speed reader, so she could essentially like glimpse a paragraph and intuit the meaning of the paragraph and then just keep going. And so she was she had this love of literature and the creative arts, but then was a really logical thinker as well. Like, so when she did end up getting a job, she was working as a bookkeeper, and she was just brilliant with figures and numbers, and she was really interested in the world. She always, our houses were always filled with, atlases and encyclopedias, and she was obsessed with politics. She would listen to, Question Time on the radio, and so she was just constantly consuming lots of different information, but still able to make sense of it all.
So on this fateful Easter barbecue, your mum and dad meet one another and get together. Why did they decide to become foster parents, Lech?
So Mum had a series of miscarriages. So Mum had been exposed to the foster care system previously because she'd actually fostered some of her siblings in her early 20s when her mother went into a psychiatric hospital. And so she'd moved to Queensland, and then a couple of her siblings came up to live with her, and she'd fostered them and sent them off to school. And so she'd been exposed to the foster care system before, and she had this real yearning to create like a happy, stable family, the kind of happy, stable place that she didn't have growing up. So I think that as tragic as it was that she had these miscarriages, I think that her mind pretty quickly turned to the idea of, okay, well, I can't have children, but I still want a family, and so I'm going to become a foster mother.
And how did fostering work at that time? Was it commonly that you would just have kids for a little while, or would children live with a family more permanently than that?
It just ranged. So their initial foster care placements were kind of short-term placements. So they were taking teenage boys from boys' homes in Brisbane and giving them somewhere to stay on the holidays, and just kind of learning the ropes around that, and proving to themselves and proving to the social workers that they were ready for permanent placements, which is really what my mum wanted. But the social workers are always kind of very upfront that the aim of the department was to reunite children with their parents. And so she went in with her eyes wide open about that. She wasn't expecting a miracle. She wasn't expecting these kids to rock up at the age of 6 months and then just be perfect kind of placements. She knew that there would be complications involved, both from the perspective of the children, because a lot of the children that came to stay with her initially had severe, learning disabilities, and also from the perspective of the parents of these children.
She's had a lot of love to give as a person. Is that the kind of character that she was, your mum?
Yeah, a real just burning desire to have like a place of safety and sanity. And I think because she was so quiet, she was such a patient sort of person. She was just perfect as a foster carer when these kids were coming in, and it just always felt for them like they were in a safe place where there wasn't going to be chaos or raised voices or yelling. Like, she was very softly spoken. I can't remember hearing her raise a voice.
Did she and your dad have different parenting styles then?
Yep. Yeah. So I've spoken to some of the teenage boys who are now, men in their 50s who came to stay with them, and they say that, mum was just this beacon of kind of warmth, and dad was just this man mountain who was quite scary to them at first, because he was this man mountain with a massive beard and a massive beer gut and big arms and big legs, and they had to kind of get over their initial fear of him and then realise that he was just a gentle giant as well, and that a lot of them had been exposed to all this trauma, but they would tell me that they, sitting on the couch with my dad on a Friday night just felt like the safest place in the world. Like, you once you were in with him, you felt like nobody would ever hurt you, or because he was so fearless, he was so larger than life, and that he was fiercely protective of other people, especially vulnerable people.
So it ended up that 6 kids did come to stay permanently, pretty much, with your mum and dad. And then in 1992, there was another big change in the family. What happened?
Well, mum had started taking a hormone replacement drug called Premarin, which she got slightly illegally because it was a treatment for menopause, and she wasn't suffering from menopause yet. She was in her late 30s, but she'd read in Reader's Digest that there was a woman in America who had started taking this and had fallen pregnant for the first time and had a child. And so I think she got one of Dad's sisters to get her a prescription and sent it off to the pub in Wandai. And then, she fell pregnant with me. And I think throughout that whole fostering period, she never really lost the desire to have a child. I think that as much as she treated her foster children like they were biological children in terms of the love that she provided them, there was like kind of a missing link in terms of her experience of motherhood. And she really wanted that early period, which is so unique. And so I was very lucky that she never gave up hope. And here I am today.
And when you were born into that family, like with these bigger brothers and sisters, what are your early memories of how they treated you, how they responded to you being there?
Well, I don't have, obviously, the memory of those, that first year. But right throughout my life, no matter what has been happening, I think one of the things that has carried me through is this sense of love that was there in my first 2 years. And so I was just showered with adoration. And I had 2 parents who adored me, but I had, 6 siblings who also adored me. And many of them had been old enough to know that my mum had suffered miscarriages, because she kept on suffering miscarriages throughout the 80s. And so they'd been through that roller coaster with her, and they knew how special it was that she'd had a child, and they were on, Team Lech. They didn't see me as like a threat to their place in the family, because my parents weren't operating that way. It was never about replacing them. It was about adding to the family. And so in a weird way, I think that as much as that was an amazing gift to have in my early childhood, it actually also created issues, because then when I went out into the world, I had to get used to the fact that not everyone else saw me as a miracle or as a messiah. And so when I went off to kindergarten and I was like trying to boss the teachers around and boss the kids around, it was a slow process throughout childhood and adolescence to realise, I'm just like everyone else.
How old were your 3 of your siblings, Stephen, John and Hannah? How old were they when you came along?
So Steve was 9, John was 8, and Hannah was 2. Hannah had arrived, I think, 48 hours before I was conceived. So even though there was an age gap between us, we very much stuck to each other like glue. She was a really intensely protective older sister, and Mum used to dress us in colour-coordinated outfits. And she also, because she was a bit closer to me in age, when all the other kids had already gone off to school and even kindergarten, me and Hannah were kind of left at home to rule the roost. And so there was a very intense connection between us.
The biological parents of Hannah, John and Steve went by a few different names, but we'll stick with Michael and Mary Shelley. What sort of background had they come from, Michael and Mary Shelley? Like, how did it compare to your mum and dad, say?
Incredibly different backgrounds. So Mary had been born in London and was the subject of a really high-profile custody dispute. So both her parents were having affairs, and then they got divorced. It was a landmark divorce case within the British legal system. And then when Mary was 11, her father took her out of boarding school and flew to Sydney without the approval of Mary's mother or the approval of the courts. So it was essentially a kidnapping, but they flew into Sydney. Mary's father, Sidney Newgrosh, was a very successful businessman. And so he opened a bar and restaurant called the Chelsea in King's Cross and was kind of like a very decorated figure on the Sydney social scene. And, you know, Robert Menzies would go to his restaurant, Frank Sinatra would go to his restaurant. And Mary was this beautiful teenage girl who then met a singer named Lionel Long when she was 16. And Lionel was about to become Australia's greatest selling musician of all time at that point in the early 60s. And so she was really part of a totally different world to my parents.
She was on the cover of the Women's Weekly at some point.
Yeah, well, she got engaged to Lionel and then she was put on the front cover of Women's Weekly in 1962. Yeah, and I think they were living in Bellevue Hill and, you know, Lionel had a bunch of yachts stationed in Rushcutters Bay and he ended up becoming an actor as well and was a star on the TV show Homicide. And, yeah, it was a very different world.
And what about Michael Shelley? What was going on with him before he met Mary?
Michael Shelley, well, yeah, that's there's so much. But Michael Shelley grew up on the North Shore of Sydney. He went to Knox Grammar. He also had a famous first love, or someone who would eventually become famous, which was the actress Jackie Weaver. So they met each other at a dance and began this kind of very intense love affair as adolescences. And eventually Jackie broke up with him and left him for a famous singer named Brian Davies, who'd actually starred on Bandstand with Lionel Long. So their worlds weren't that far apart. Michael was North Shore, Mary was eastern suburbs in Sydney, and Michael went off to university. He was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, incredibly intelligent young man. Like he'd really succeeded at school without much effort. He was really high IQ and went off to university, did a chemical engineering degree. He did a Masters of Business Administration and was part of this world in Sydney in terms of the journalists and writers and architects, many of whom would become quite famous. And, he was part of all this different social manoeuvring and also having a lot of sex as well during the whole free and easy period of the Vietnam War protests.
So where did these two sort of socialites meet one another for the first time, Mary and Michael?
Well, Michael left his white-collar job and started a bar called The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization as We Know It. So the writing might have been on the wall at that point that this is a guy with apocalyptic tendencies. And a few years after that, he was, getting covered in the papers in Sydney and people were sort of celebrating him as this really kind of charismatic entrepreneur. He did the Sydney to Hobart yacht race and played the guitar, and he ended up leaving his first wife, marrying someone else. A year after that, he suffered a nervous breakdown. He went bankrupt. And so this kind of gilded life that seemed on the offing for him really, went bust. He ended up in a psychiatric hospital called the Prince Henry Hospital on the eastern shores of Sydney. And this is where he met Mary.
What was she doing there?
Well, Mary's marriage with Lionel Long had broken down and she also subsequently remarried, but she was suffering from significant mental health issues. And so she'd been in and out of hospital throughout the 70s, suffering with postpartum depression, suffering with bipolar. And she ended up back in hospital. And at this point, this is where her paths crossed with Michael Shelley, who was this beautiful, charismatic guy. And she said that she fell in love with Michael the first time that they met.
What understanding of Christianity did they both come to subscribe to? How did that come to play such a big part in their thinking?
So Michael was reading the Bible with Mary, and they were kind of just hippie, new age sort of stuff, trying to find different ways to think about things. And it started to snowball a little bit. And Michael kind of came across the Archangel Michael in the Bible, and he sort of saw himself, and he saw this alternative destiny. And yeah, it was never like it's not like he went off and did a theological course. I think they were both desperate for an alternative life, and Michael probably had a fair bit of underlying narcissism, and so the idea for him that he was a messiah maybe had been operating underneath the surface over the previous decade. But then once he started to go down this Christianity rabbit hole, it kind of enabled a lot of the tendencies that he had, and so he literally began to believe that he was a prophet of God and that he had been put on earth to spread the gospel of Jesus, and that Mary was his offsider in doing that, or prophetess as he described her.
So how did they change their lives practically after getting out of the psych ward and having this religious awakening?
Well, they began just by changing their dress and their hairstyles and the way that they would talk. And then they were running into trouble while doing this because people around them were saying this is mad and trying to stage interventions. And so eventually they decided that they needed to get out of Sydney. And Michael looked around and tried to find, I guess, the most Satanistic place in Australia. And in his view, that was the state of Queensland. So he looked north, and in 1980, this is after Mary had fallen pregnant, they hitchhiked from Sydney to far north Queensland. They ditched all of their belongings.
What were they surviving on financially?
Nothing. They didn't believe in money, so they would hitchhike. They would ask for shelter from churches. They would stay at motels and leave them without paying. They would, go to churches, ask for food. They were barefoot. They had a Bible. That was about it. So they were just like hitchhiking along these highways throughout central Queensland and North Queensland, and eventually got to a place called Kuranda, north of Cairns, in a kind of rainforest setting in the September of 1980, which is where they had their first son, Elijah.
So after Elijah was born, why did the family come to the attention of the authorities?
Well, the Shelleys were hitchhiking with their infant child, and they were rocking up to churches and knocking on the door, demanding shelter. And so they would inevitably run into trouble because overnight they would have taken all the food from the fridge. Michael had a real obsession with interior design, so he would rearrange all the furniture, and he thought that there was something very godly about what he was doing. And then when the people who were sheltering them asked him to leave, Michael would launch into diatribes about, the fact that they had loveless marriages, or that they were abused as children, that they were overweight, that their diet was bad, and they were getting arrested for, harassment and also vagrancy. They didn't have any money. And this is when Elijah came to the attention of the police officers and then of the Department of Child Safety.
And he was then removed from Michael and Mary and put into a foster family in the suburbs of Brisbane. How did Michael and Mary react to that? What did they do about their son being taken?
Well, they reacted apocalyptically. They staged a campaign across Australia. They went to Canberra and would rock up to Question Time, and they would do interviews with newspapers, and it was a quite high-profile case. And Michael, said, "I'm going to find my son and take him back," and that's exactly what he ended up doing.
The Shelleys found where Elijah was being fostered, and they did kidnap him and took off to Canberra, where he was found by authorities and taken away from the Shelleys again. The couple then had two more sons, Saul and Joshua, who came to live with your parents when they were still little boys. Why did they change their names to Steve and John?
Well, after what had happened to Elijah, that really ruined, I think, the possibility that the Shelleys were going to be able to have like a sustainable relationship with the Department of Child Safety. And so Elijah was placed back into foster care and then moved to a different foster home. His name was changed to Michael as a way to protect his identity from the Shelleys. And then when Saul and Joshua were placed into foster care, there was very much a sense that these children were at great threat of being kidnapped by Michael and Mary. And so the decision was made that their names would be changed to Stephen and John.
And your mum and dad were aware of this backstory of their parents and I guess of the risk that they might come looking for these little boys?
Yeah, they were across this story because it had been everywhere in the papers in Queensland. They kind of saw that as, I think, a great challenge in a different way. So I think that mum just saw these vulnerable children who needed somewhere to live, and she would do anything to provide protection to them. And I think that Dad kind of liked the idea of Michael Shelley potentially rocking up one day. I think he'd been waiting for that kind of excitement in his life. Like, the Michael Shelley was someone who saw people like my father as being subhuman, and yeah, my father kind of saw these little boys who were in need, and the idea that, you know, Michael Shelley might threaten them was even more of a reason to kind of protect them. In some ways, Dad was the most inappropriate foster carer for the children of Christian fanatics. He was a publican in country Queensland, a heavy gambler, a heavy drinker, but then he was also perfect as well because he was so physically fearless that, yeah, he just wasn't put off by the idea that their parents were potentially dangerous.
By this point, Lech, the Shelleys had 3 sons together, all of whom over time had been taken into foster care, the youngest 2, Steve and John, coming to live with your family. The children had been removed from the Shelleys because of concerns about their physical and emotional well-being, but the Shelleys desperately wanted their kids back. How are they going about trying to get them?
They'd been stalking the Queensland Premier, Mike Ahern, and so they'd been threatening various politicians throughout Australia in the 80s, but with Mike Ahern it was very vicious and they were kind of threatening to kill him. Yeah, it was a massive case in Queensland, and the Shelleys managed to get away. They hid out in the Adelaide Hills for a while. Mary fell pregnant again. I think she was 47 at that stage, and they decided that they needed to go to New Zealand, otherwise their child would be taken off them.
I guess it's impossible to really know, Lech, but I mean, to what degree do you think that sort of behaviour, you know, the death threats against a Queensland Premier, is that a consequence of what they'd been through, of having their children taken away from them, or was it a mark more of their illness, their, you know, general unfitness to be parents?
It's very hard to say. I don't think that the Shelleys, when they went to Queensland in 1980, arrived as fully fledged kind of Christian fanatics. I think that there was a genuine sense that they were trying to create a different lifestyle. And I think that gradually as time went on and they got in more trouble, it kind of deepened their delusions. And the fact that they'd lost their children actually made it harder for them to reconnect with reality, because if they reconnected with reality, they would be admitting that they had lost custody of their children over religious delusions. And so they kind of went further and further into this rabbit hole where whenever they were persecuted, it was kind of proof for Michael that he was the chosen one, because, you know, Jesus had said in the Gospel of Matthew, you will be persecuted by following me. And so, you know, I think that there was very genuine level of grief, especially for Mary. For Michael, I think that it was more of an ego injury, and he was kind of caught up in this idea of himself as being a persecuted prophet.
You say that Mary was pregnant again. Where did she have that baby? Under what sort of circumstances?
So they stayed at a motel in a place called Wanganui. They didn't tell the manager that Mary was about to give birth, and the next morning she had a baby girl named Hannah. And so Michael, in his writing, kind of details with great vividness him delivering this baby. So there was no midwives, and he bragged about the fact that they were able to leave this motel without any sign of what had just happened.
And so how did this little baby girl then end up in your family just before you were conceived?
Well, the Shelleys did it in New Zealand, what they'd been doing in Queensland throughout the 80s, and they were doing runners on motels. They stole a van from a church group called Operation Good Samaritan. They drove that van from Wellington to Auckland, and they were eventually arrested. Michael was placed in Mount Eden prison, and Hannah was placed into foster care. She was in a series of foster care placements in her first year of life. And my mother discovered the existence of Hannah through the Department of Child Safety, and she was desperate to reunite Hannah with her older brothers. She would do whatever it took to get Hannah to rejoin the family. But it was a very audacious thing to do, because it was a separate country, and something like that doesn't happen very often. So it took a lot of legal wrangling. But in the autumn of 1991, Hannah's social worker, Peter, boarded the plane with Hannah and they flew into Brisbane and then drove evasively from the Brisbane airport to the Wandai Hotel where my parents and their foster children were waiting on the front deck for Hannah and just kind of absolutely ecstatic about her arrival, and especially Stephen and John, because they knew that this was their biological sister.
Do you think your mum and dad were readying themselves for the Shelleys to turn up? Was there part of them that would have been expecting, although these three kids were now reunited as part of the bigger Blaine family, that Mary and Michael were not just going to let this go?
That was part of the deal. They'd been told when they fostered Stephen and John that Michael and Mary will try to find you and eventually they might succeed, and you need to be prepared for that emotionally, but also on a really pragmatic level in terms of the safety precautions that were taken with them growing up around not being allowed to get photographed for the local paper and not being on the electoral rolls and having silent numbers. And so it was something that they lived with. I think that Dad was very good at compartmentalising things. I think that, he lived in the present, and so he was very much, okay, these are my sons, this is my daughter, and we're just going to do what we need to do. I think Mum was always conscious of the fact that the Shelleys were potentially going to arrive, and she was keeping constant record of the newspaper articles about their activities and I think already living with a kind of mild anxiety about the existence of the Shelleys.
Well, in 2002, that day came. Your family had moved to Toowoomba by that stage. What do you remember happening on that day?
I was at cricket training with Dad, and so I remember getting home and John was at the end of the street and just kind of shell-shocked and shivering, and he said, my mother is here. And it didn't make sense that there was another mother. I always knew that the Shelleys existed. This is one of the things that my parents did really well, especially Mum, was that she never shied away from the fact that my siblings were fostered. Mum narrated the story of what had happened to them. They didn't come from her tummy. They came from a different woman's tummy, and that other woman loved them very much, but she wasn't able to look after them. And so there was no big kind of like epiphany for anyone. We always knew about it, and I always knew about it. But yeah, the Shelleys had spent all the 90s in New Zealand, so they weren't an ever-present threat. But they get back in 2000, they find us in 2002. And
so your brother's saying, my mum's here, and at first you don't even know what that could possibly mean.
It was just like, Mum was super aware that they were getting kind of closer and closer to us in Toowoomba. But yeah, it was just out of this world, and the street was filled with police cars. Mum and my older brother Stephen were being interviewed by the police on the street. And yeah, from that moment, it really felt like our lives changed in a fairly fundamental way.
How had they found your family?
My mum had facilitated contact between my foster siblings and their biological grandmother, and she died. And Michael had gone back to her house in Sydney and discovered all of this correspondence and photos of my siblings and their names and the address of where they lived. And so Michael knew that if he rocked up to our house, that he would be immediately arrested and would go back to prison for a fairly long time. So he kind of sent Mary in his battering ram, and they just came face to face. And he was Mary, who'd been on the front cover of Women's Weekly, and she had hair to her waist and long flowing dress. And he was my mum in a pair of thongs and tracksuit pants and a T-shirt and, big kind of nerdy glasses and short hair. And yeah, they were just so visibly different. And Mum had every right to slam the door in her face and call the police because she legally wasn't allowed to be there. There was a protection order. But I think that it was so shocking. And also the fact that she was there, I think Mum wanted to show that she didn't have anything to hide. She didn't have a bone to pick with the Shelleys, especially with Mary. She'd always sympathised with the fact that Mary had lost her children. And so she said, if you just come around the back, I'll go and tell the kids and get them to come outside. And so Hannah, at the age of 11, she was turning 12, was this kind of incredibly confident, buff tomboy. And yeah, she had short hair like my mum. She kind of had abs and biceps, and later that year she would be the captain of the Queensland hockey team. And so
this wasn't the kind of traditional femininity that Mary and Michael Shelley wanted for their daughter.
This was not the template of femininity that especially Michael had been imagining. And I think on a more emotional level, it was incredibly shocking for Mary to see this daughter who visibly didn't have anything in common with her. In fact, on the surface had so much in common with my mother and the way that she spoke and the way that she held herself. And yeah, that was, that became like very quickly a point of contention. And Mary berated my mother for cutting Hannah's hair too short.
You said that after Mary Shelley appeared at your family's front door that day, your lives changed really radically. In what way?
Well, Mum was a prolific diarist, and she wrote a note in her diary that day, not long after Mary arrived, saying 5:01, Mary Shelley, life will never be the same. And so there were all these tangible things. Like we went to stay in a motel and we were offered police protection, and because there was a genuine fear that the Shelleys might try to kidnap Hannah. And we were bombarded from that point onwards with letters, really vicious letters to my parents, and, demanding that they give back Hannah, demanding money, kind of saying that they would be wiped off the earth if they didn't. And so there's all those tangible things. But I think just on a broader level, it hadn't been a delusion, but we had just felt like such a normal family, even though, we were raised in pubs and there was all these different kids and all these kind of vivid personalities, but we felt so safe. We did not have sheltered upbringings. We walked the streets freely and we were really allowed to do whatever we wanted to. And we all felt in different ways, I think, quite brave. And I think that definitely changed after the arrival of the Shelleys, at least during that really intense period of stalking. I was a very happy-go-lucky on the surface, but quite anxious kid in terms of I had a very vivid imagination. I was a massive reader, and so I kind of like would visualise all the ways that the Shelleys might kidnap Hannah or even kidnap me, and that they would take us off to some convent and make me grow my hair long and change my name to Moses or something like that. So it showed to us the way that we weren't a real family. We weren't just the Blaines. There was an asterisk there, which had always kind of we'd been aware of, but it hadn't been made kind of so explicit. And from that point onwards, in terms of the way that we had to conduct ourselves, we couldn't just walk to school on our own. We couldn't, just hang around on the streets because the Shelleys might be lurking.
One day when you were 11, Lech, you saw Mary outside the window. What happened?
Well, Hannah and me had been left at home for a brief period because Mum was going out to do something with our other sister, Rebecca, and the doors were locked, but I saw Mary walk up the driveway. I was sitting at the computer, and so I jumped up and ran to the living room and told Hannah that her mother was there, and so she grabbed the phone and we hid under my parents' bed, and Hannah called the police and she called my father, and my dad drove home and drove through the front gate and looked around everywhere. The police arrived and my mum came home and they couldn't find Mary anywhere, and so the police went back to the streets to try and find her. My dad went back to the pub because he thought that the Shelleys might go there. And then an hour or so later, Hannah went to her bedroom. She was living in a granny flat just at the back of the house, so it was slightly separate from the house. And she'd forgotten to lock the door, and so she opened the door and Mary Shelley was lying on her bed. Hannah's scream just filled not just the house but the street. Like, it was so shocking for her because Mary opened her eyes and she had Hannah's clothes in her fist and a photo of Hannah on her heart. I think that at that moment, Hannah couldn't see Mary as, a vulnerable woman who was just desperate for contact with her daughter. She just saw this kind of monstrous figure. And Steve came home, Mary's biological son, and he got her to leave the bedroom and really lost patience with her at that point because we'd gone through 18 months of just constant harassment and constant threats. And I think that my mum had slowly suffered an epiphany that the Shelleys weren't so much literally going to kidnap Hannah as they wanted to make life so intolerable for my parents that my parents would give up custody of Hannah because they saw my parents as being so inappropriate, such bogans, so overweight, that they would just make life so intolerable. They would send the most sickening accusations, and that eventually my parents would just throw their hands in the air and say, we can't deal with this anymore. And I think that they definitely underestimated Mum and Dad on that front. And so, Dad would say to Hannah, like, I'd jump in front of a truck before I let anyone put a finger on you. And I can remember one night when we went back to the motel again and Hannah saying, Mum, we'll have to go somewhere else to live, and Mum saying, over my dead body, and that's the kind of language that you didn't really hear Mum say very much. Like, she wasn't a fire and brimstone sort of person. But nothing that the Shelleys could do other than killing my parents would make them give up custody of Hannah. Hannah was theirs, and they loved her just as much as they loved me, and nothing could change that.
It did take an enormous toll, of course, though, on all of you, and I guess most especially on your mum and dad. How did it play out in terms of their relationship, the stress of the Shelleys reappearing in this campaign of relentless harassment and threat?
So we ended up having to move house, and there was a lot of legal dramas in this period, but what eventually happened was that there was a really strong restraining order put in place, not just for the Shelleys not to make contact with Hannah, but also with my parents. And if they did, then they were going to jail for a very long time. And so we moved house. They didn't know where we were living, so it kind of slowed down a bit. And in that period, I wasn't really aware of it at the time or conscious of it at the time, but Dad could be not particularly emotionally sensitive about some things, but his attitude towards life was, that's happened, let's keep going, let's keep doing what we're doing, and everything's going to be fine. And that was really, really good for us. We kind of needed that, the kids. We kind of, just started going on holidays, and Dad just got us back out into the world and kept us going, whereas Mum became very much stuck in that period. I think she was suffering essentially from undiagnosed PTSD, and she never stopped waiting for the Shelleys to rock up. She had a real physical fear of them, and she'd taken their threats very literally. And I think it in a way, Mum had dedicated her life to this vocation of being a foster carer and protecting children, including abused children. And so all those years of the Shelleys rocking up to Parliament House and announcing on the news that my parents were child abusers and that my mother was an enabler of pedophilia, it was just the worst thing that you could say to my mother. It was just horrendous. And so I think that she became stuck with the Shelleys in that battle in a way that my father wasn't. And so I think that fundamentally changed their relationship as well. Mum became quite, she was never the life of the party beforehand, but she would stay at home a lot more, and she didn't like going to shopping centres, and she was always worried that the Shelleys might be, around the corner.
When did you reach out yourself and make contact with Michael Shelley?
So Mum was an incredible diarist. She kept diaries since she was a teenager. She kept meticulous files about all of her foster care placements, but especially Stephen, John and Hannah, because their cases were so controversial. She had all the newspaper clippings, she had all the letters, and she'd always joked throughout this whole period, because she had a very wry sense of humour, my mum. She would always say, after whatever had just happened, she'd say, I'm going to write a book about the Shelley gang one day.
The Shelley gang.
She used to call them the Shelley gang, yeah. And so I always, as a kid and then as an adolescent who had very, massive literary ambitions, I would think, who would ever want to read a book about the Shelleys? But in 2013, my mum had been suffering from different issues for quite a while, and that had been misdiagnosed. And so I took her to the doctor that year, and she was diagnosed with a neurological illness, which was terminal. Dad had died in 2011 of a really sudden stroke, so that was pretty shocking. And then Mum was diagnosed with this illness in 2013, so 2 years later, and I was 21 at the time, so I went home that summer and I organised Mum's nursing home admission and also for the house to be sold. And Mum was in hospital at that point, so I'd go up every night to take Mum down for a smoke, because she was still smoking Long Beach menthols, and she, even though she was starting to exhibit serious symptoms of this illness, she had a remarkable memory. Like, her brain was still filing on a lot of cylinders, and she was telling me a lot of stuff about not so much just the Shelleys, but about her marriage to my father and about her own background. And then I would go home, and I was packing all the house up, but I became obsessed with all my mum's office of files, and I started going through them all. And I was realising how much more interesting the Shelleys were than just Christian fanatics. Mum had all this detail about them, and, you know, it wasn't just the death threats, but it was about their backgrounds and stuff. And so I just kind of, in a weird way, became as obsessed as the Shelleys were, but with the Shelleys. Like, I sort of realised that they were really interesting people. And I also knew that my mum was never going to get to write this book. And I decided that I wanted to write this book on her behalf. And so I asked her if I could have access to all of her files. And I said, Mum, you know, is it all right if I write this book? And she said, oh, I don't think anyone will find me that interesting. Because I wanted to not just write about the Shelleys, I wanted to write about Mum and Dad as well. And so, I just spent that summer packing up the house and really sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night because I was going through every single file and making sure that I either read everything or kept what needed to be kept. And so I just ended up with this massive trove of letters and photos, and it really started this process which ended up taking 11 years of both researching the lives of the Shelleys, researching the lives of my parents, and then writing a book about these two couples.
And you reached out to Michael Shelley in the process of that. How did he react to your queries about him and the fact that you're the son of this hated family?
Well, so I went back to Brisbane and I knew that I would have to get in contact with Michael. And the Shelleys had been inundating my mum still with emails, not just about the custody case, but just about their general travails. So they'd gone to South Africa and France and Southeast Asia, and they'd stalked the Pope and Desmond Tutu. And so Mum had been getting these daily updates about their lives. And so it was just this incredible trove of information. But I emailed Michael Shelley out of the blue and I said, you know, I'm Lech Blaine, I'm the son of Tom and Lenore, and I want to write a book about you and your biological children and my parents. And I was terrified, because I was still terrified of Michael Shelley at that stage. Like, he was this guy that was just, in a different way to my father, just larger than life, and he instilled so much fear in all of us for so long. And I was just amazed because he was absolutely delighted to hear from me, and he was delighted to have someone who was willing to listen to everything that he had to say and read all of his files. And he sent me his autobiography up until the age of 27, detailing his all of his sexual affairs in Sydney, and, you know, he'd write about them with a slight disapproving tone, but it was just bizarre. And I got that, but that's where I got so much more information than what had been on the public record.
The 4 parents at the heart of this story are all dead now, your mum and dad, and also Michael and Mary Shelley. In immersing yourself in all of the details of their stories, the emails and letters and court documents, where has it left your sense of what parenting is, what makes a good parent, and what drives parents to behave in some of the ways they do?
I think my understandings of my parents have changed significantly. You know, I'm 32 now. I'm kind of going through a similar life stages to what my parents did when they were meeting and then having children, and I'm just amazed by what they did. Like, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked still. Like, that my mum, who hadn't had children at the age of 28, was willing to foster a boy with autism, foster a girl with alcohol fetal syndrome, foster children who were the biological children of Christian fanatics. And I think it just radically changes my appreciation of what Mum did. You know, Dad was very much a part of that as well. Dad was willing to go there with Mum, but he wasn't engaged with it in the same way that Mum was on a kind of like intellectual level. And I think that one of the reasons why she succeeded so much as a mother was her ability to tolerate imperfection. I think one of the really magical things that Mum did was that she just accepted us whoever we were.
What about your feelings or thoughts about the Shelleys, who, you know, had terrorised your family really for so long, but in immersing yourself in their experience and what it was like for them to have these children and then not be allowed or able to care for them, did you find yourself having a different kind of sympathy or understanding for them?
Yeah, my feelings about the Shelleys have been revolutionised. And seeing my sister Hannah with her children and having those conversations with her about how she would feel if her children were taken for whatever reason. You know, Hannah's a magnificent mother. She's a neuropsychologist in Alice Springs. She's remarkable. But like her feelings changed towards Mary Shelley, and that kind of like shifted things for me as well. Like because I haven't got children of my own, but I look at my Hannah's children, and Lenny, and who's named after my mother, and Freddie, and yeah, just that kind of like intense, visceral fear of something happening to them and not being able to be there for them. And yeah, I think so. There's that, but there's also all that research into the Shelleys' background and seeing them as the product of very unique life experiences, especially Mary. By the point that she rocks up on that front door, as much as we couldn't see her as being this frail, vulnerable woman, that's very much what she was. She was just a woman who wanted to see her daughter and wanted to see her sons. And that doesn't mean that I just go, yeah, it's okay what they did to my parents, but it changes, my understanding of it. And it allows me to kind of empathise with her in a way that I couldn't, especially in my adolescence. I was very fearful of them, then I became very angry of them. And over the past decade of all this research, I've kind of gone, this is way more complex than what I possibly could have understood when I embarked on this process. Like there's so many different cycles going a long way back. And that's what makes breaking that cycle by my parents so remarkable, is that I see my siblings now with their children, and I know that their children are never going to have that fear of abandonment. They're never going to be afraid of their parents. They're never going to be afraid of their parents not being around. They're never going to have that really visceral separation that happened to my siblings when they were infants. And that is going to mean that they'll be able to approach life from a baseline level of love. And so that's the gift of love that my parents gave to my siblings, and that's the gift of love that I really wanted to share with people by writing this book.
Lech, thank you so much for telling some of this extraordinary story on Conversations.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Lech Blaine's book is Australian Gospel. This conversation was produced by Nicola Harrison and recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. The executive producer of Conversations is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.